Greetings ladies and gents, welcome back to the Craft Hammer. I'm your host Stefan, and in today's video we're continuing on with our mini tutorials to help you, the new beginner, learn a few things about certain aspects of the hobby. In today's video we're going to be talking about the wet palette and whether or not you need these so that you can paint your minis to a great tabletop standard. Now, we're not talking about super high painting that will win you a golden demon. We're just talking about, do you need this for a tabletop standard so that your army can be fielded on the game? In short, you don't technically need this. You can go without it. You can just use a normal palette, or some people even use a tile and then they put water to kind of thin down their paints on the tile itself. So it's not that it's a necessity, but it definitely helps make things easier, especially when it comes to controlling the consistency of your paint, especially if it is, let's say, a more thicker and more difficult to use paint. And when it comes to brighter paint like white and yellow, that can definitely end up a bit chalky if not properly thinned down, which can obviously affect the way your model looks. Although it's not a necessity, it does help make things a bit easier. Let's go through some of the basic concepts of a wet palette. Overall, it is just a flat tray. There isn't particularly anything special about these trays. Generally, they're just made very thin for the purposes of getting your paint on it. Obviously, you can see them online when some people make their own and they use lunch boxes, which of course have a high wall. In this scenario, very thin so that it's easier to kind of get your paintbrush in and out. This is an older version that I've had for quite a while and I've used over the years to paint my models. I generally use it for base layers that need a tiny bit more work to be made a bit more thin, and they're not the same consistency as a contrast paint. When you are using the wet palette, we won't be using it for contrast paint, because in reality what we're actually doing with this whole scenario is making a normal paint somewhat similar to a contrast paint, but maybe not as thin. For those of you who are curious what exactly is required for a wet palette, you need some sort of tray, hopefully not too high walls. You get yourself one of these sponges. Now this hasn't been used for a while, so of course it is a bit dry, but what we will do is quickly just pour some water onto this sponge and hopefully that will help soften it back up. I have had to go get a tiny bit more water. You don't need to completely flood this. Technically this could work, but it is still a tiny bit dry. So you just want that ability that when you do kind of stroke the sponge, your finger does get a tiny bit more wet than just a kind of slight mist. So don't over flood it, but also don't put too little water. So as you can see, once I just press it a bit, I can see the water that is clinging onto my finger. So that would be a pretty decent consistency. Again, it's not the worst thing if it does flood, but it will, I guess, oversaturate your paints and make them very thin, and to be honest, probably too runny for use. The next part of this is these interesting hydration papers. I've seen people use baking paper, the ones that aren't, I guess, the ones that aren't wax based, so they do allow some sort of water to get through them, otherwise the wet palette won't work. And as you can see, once we put down the paper, it will start to curl up by itself, but don't worry, it will fall back down once the paper itself has, I guess, absorbed a bit of that water. So as you can see, it's starting to unfold again. Pretty straightforward concept. Once this has happened, you are ready to go. You will get your paint, put a nice little drop somewhere on the palette itself. Pretty straightforward. Then get your brush, get a bit of water on that brush, not too much. And what you want to do is you drag a tiny bit away from that spot and you mix in more paint to create the consistency that you're looking for. So overall, it's not super complex to get your grips and get your hands on one of these palettes, and it does make painting so much easier. Not as runny as a contrast paint, but not as thick as a normal paint if you were to just put it on a normal palette or a piece of paper that will dry it out, or even a tile. So it definitely keeps in moisture for longer. So if you're painting for a few hours, a wet palette is definitely better than a tile, as the wet palette will help keep the moisture to the paint for much longer. Now, do not use any sort of metallic paints on your palette. It will damage the papers themselves, but also it will start to seep into the sponge, and it could damage the sponge itself, since the metallic flakes can be, I guess, a bit harsh on the materials here. Now, this does say that you should only be using acrylic paints. I'm not entirely sure if this would be a good idea for oil paints. That would probably be a completely different topic, and it is something that I've never used, so can't really comment on it. When you're using normal acrylic paints, this is a great tool to get you that nice, wonderful consistency, so that when you're putting it on the model, it is a great paint. So that is the basic concepts. Once you're finished and there's too much paint on this sheet of paper, take the sheet of paper, throw it out. You can technically store your paints here. If, let's say, you paint for 3 hours, then you're going to sleep, and the next day you want to paint for another few hours, you can close it down with the lid, and depending on how much water you have in there, it should keep them moist. Although if it is a bit flooded too much, it will in fact make them super thin, and then when you come back the next day, you might actually see them kind of spread out even more than they were the day before. There are a bunch of different wet palettes out there. Some of them are more expensive than others. To be honest, I wouldn't recommend spending too much. Just get a good quality one with sponges and quite a few papers that will last you for a while. Again, you don't need anything too fancy. They shouldn't be that expensive, so do be a bit cautious and a bit skeptical when you see the ones that are super expensive. Otherwise, definitely recommend for a new beginner to get one of these. It will help your painting process and your painting learning at such a much better rate, and will help you get those consistencies that are really useful for a nice smooth paint. Hopefully you found this mini tutorial useful. Don't forget to comment down below, make sure to like this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And until next time, take care folks.